Okay, so I think folks will continue trickling in, but just to be respectful of time, I'm going to start. Hello everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you here on Zoom, and just really grateful that you're joining us. I know there's a lot of sort of Zoom fatigue these days, but it's just such a joy to also be gathering here with all of you. So my name is Crystal Moonhead Peck. I'm an associate professor in gender and sexuality studies at UCR. I'm calling you from the unceded ancestral lands, the Tongva people in Los Angeles. And I want to welcome you to the last, but certainly not the least, of the 3 book salon series events that we've been organizing this year. So it's co-sponsored by Gender and Sexuality Studies, or GSST, and along with UCR Center for Ideas and Society. So I know some of you have joined us for some of our past events, but during the months of October, November, and January, GSST has been celebrating and also reading the timely publication of 3 new books by our faculty, including Professor Brandon Andrew Robinson, who you'll be hearing from in a second. And we're inviting all of you to read along with us for an exciting dialogue held here on Zoom, where each author will be in conversation with a scholar in their field, and as well as with the audience. And we're also working with presses to offer significant discounts for these publications for interested readers. Hold on for one second, let me accept more people to the room. Okay, great. So before I introduce our wonderful interlocutors today, just one note: we are recording the event, so hopefully you should have received a notification. So hopefully that's okay. Let me actually move to introducing our speakers today. So today's event will focus on Professor Robinson's newly published book, Coming Out to the Streets, LGBTQ Youth Experiencing Homelessness, that was published by University of California Press in November 2020. So our interlocutor who will be joining Professor Robinson today is Professor Terrell Winder from UC Santa Barbara's Department of Sociology. So thank you so much, Professor Winder, for being here. My only regret is that we couldn't host you in person, but we're so glad that you're here. So for bios, Dr. Robinson is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at UC Riverside, so a wonderful colleague and friend. Brandon received their PhD in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin. They are the author of Coming Out to the Streets, LGBTQ Youth Experiencing Homelessness, which we'll discuss today, as well as the co-author of Race and Sexuality. So in addition to these 2 books, Brandon has published in a variety of peer-reviewed academic journals, as well as other outlets. Brandon's research and writing focus on working towards social change in queer and trans liberation. So Dr. Terrell Winder is assistant professor of sociology at UC Santa Barbara and urban ethnographer. Professor Winder's research areas include race and ethnicity, sexuality and sexual health, qualitative research methods, and education. He is currently completing a book manuscript tentatively titled Unspoiling Identity: How Black Gay Men Learn to Overcome Stigma. So in this book, he examines stigma response processes among stigmatized populations who are negotiating more than one stigma simultaneously, and his research on the effect of religion on sexual and racial identity has been published in qualitative sociology. Professor Winder's health projects on the impact of HIV on Black men who have sex with men. It's also been published in AIDS, Patient Care, and STDs, the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities, and the Journal of Medical Internet Research, the 2 amazing scholars. So just really quickly, we'll launch now into a 45-50 minute conversation between Professors Robinson and Winder. So during this time, we're requesting that you keep your mics muted. And if you do have comments or questions, please feel free to share the chat section, and I'll try my best to keep track of questions. But we'll actually jump into that after the conversation with Professors Robinson and Winder. So after the conversation, we'll jump into a moderated Q&A with all of you. Because we have such a large audience, I'm actually going to be sharing the questions that are shared in the chat And then I might ask folks if we have enough time to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. So I'm going to, in the chat function, give me a second, there's more people, right, to let in. So you should see this in the chat section. I just put up the code for purchasing Dr. Robinson's book, UC Press. You can go to their website. If you use this code, there'll be a 30% discount. So very, very generous. So enough from me. I want to give the floor to Drs. Robinson and Winder.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal, for organizing this event and for being the best colleague that one can ask for. Thank you all for being here today. And of course, especially thank you to Terrell for agreeing to engage with my book with me. It's truly an honor. So Crystal asked, I'm going to try to give a 10-minute overview of my book. And then Terrell and I guess will engage in some conversation. So I guess to start, I'll start with the methods of the book and then delve into what I am doing in the book. So LGBTQ youth disproportionately make up the youth homelessness population. They make up about 40% of the youth homelessness population, even though they only make up about 5 to 8% of the overall US youth population. And most of what we knew about them was just based on survey data. And so I wanted to, of course, qualitatively understand their lives. And so I conducted this project in Central Texas, in Austin and San Antonio. So at Austin, I volunteered at a drop-in center for youth experiencing homelessness that was open 3 days a week in the afternoon from about like noon to 4. And there I mainly worked in the clothing closet, and had mostly one-on-one interactions with the youth there. And then I would conduct interviews as well. And the data was collected from January 2015 to June 2016. In San Antonio, my research looked somewhat differently in that I was specifically volunteering at an LGBTQ youth shelter that had just opened at the start of my research. It billed itself as the first LGBTQ youth shelter to exist in the South. And everyone at the youth shelter identified obviously as LGBTQ, whereas the drop-in center in Austin, there was also straight and cisgender people. And there I did overnight shifts where I basically volunteered. I was the only person there at night. All the staff left. And I was there basically from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. about 2 nights a week during my 18 months of field work. In addition to all my field work, I also conducted interviews with 40 LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness and 10 service providers, 5 at my Austin field site and 5 at my San Antonio field site. So I know Terrell and I might talk about methods, but also if anyone else has questions about methods, I always love to discuss methods. So I am open to that at the end. So overall, I have, I think, 2 major threads that I'm trying to tie throughout each chapter of this book. And these threads are linked in the sense that I'm trying to bridge urban sociology in the literature on homelessness with gender and sexuality studies and queer studies. And so the first one, in a very cliche sense, is that I'm trying to queer homelessness. So most of the literature on homelessness and most of the literature on urban sociology more broadly often focuses on race and class, or at times it might focus on gender if we're talking about the masculinity of straight men experiencing homelessness or homeless mothers. But I'm trying to bring a queer analysis to our understandings of homelessness and urban poverty and how gender and sexuality complicate our understandings of urban poverty and homelessness. And then my engagement with gender and sexuality studies and queer studies is, of course, bringing kind of a class analysis and a discussion of poverty to our understandings of queerness. And I basically argue that part of the problem is that LGBTQ literature often over-focuses on identity, and even LGBTQ politics itself has often focused overly on identity, and that we often haven't discussed embodiments, and that we're missing a deep discussion about how, at least the LGBTQ youth in my study, how they experience discrimination, rejection, policing, was through their embodiments of being mainly Black and brown, being gender expansive or trans. And And that was more through their embodiments, more than them identifying as LGBTQ, that they experience the array of violence and discrimination and the harrowing things that they did. And so I'm trying to do this kind of shift to more of an embodiment and away from this over focus, I think, on rights and identity that makes up a lot of the sexualities literature currently. So those are the two threads that are going through each chapter. Of my 5 substantive chapters, I basically see the first 2 chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, as trying to understand the youth's perceived pathways into homelessness. And so the first chapter is on the family, and the second chapter is on schools, child protective services, religion, and the workplace. And here, I think my main intervention is that I'm trying to move away from the oversimplistic notion of family rejection, which I think is often a very racist and classist narrative of understanding LGBTQ homelessness, in the sense that we know that the majority of people of LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness are Black and brown and come from backgrounds of poverty. And so if we just blame it on family rejection, then we're basically implicitly saying that Black and brown and poor parents are somehow more homophobic and transphobic than middle-class white parents, which we have no empirical evidence for. And we know it's rich white people who are often passing extremely homophobic and transphobic laws in this country. And so I'm trying to complicate that narrative by, one, showing in the family chapter how all of the youth in my study come from backgrounds of extreme poverty, extreme instability. Most of their own parents also experienced homelessness, incarceration, mental health challenges, and all the other suffering that comes from experiencing poverty and racial inequality and white supremacy. And then it's them embodying expansive expressions of gender and sexuality that often add another layer of instability within this context of already deep family instability that then pushes the youth often to the streets. As I argue, many of the youth actually go to the streets themselves. They're not necessarily kicked out. And I try to think about that as its own form of resistance to choose the streets over being in the home. And then in the chapter after that, I'm building on to, again, complicate the family rejection narrative to be like, but schools, child protective services, religion, the workplace, there's other institutions that these youth are also in that are also deeply failing the youth. And so these youth experience extreme policing of their gender and sexuality and race within the schools, within child protective services, et cetera, that also either push them out of these institutions and or they also resisted these institutions by leaving them and going to the streets. And so in that chapter, I call it the queer control complex, to think about how all these institutions actually interconnect to police the gender and sexuality of mainly young, poor, Black and brown youth, to then push them out of these institutions that are supposed to be serving youth, but are obviously violent spaces for the youth. The last 3 substantive chapters, I'm mostly looking at their experiences of homelessness and how being LGBTQ complicates that. And so the middle chapter, chapter 3, is on policing and what I call the New Lavender Scare, where I'm, of course, building on the brilliant Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, where she looks at how policing is a main way of poverty governance and upholding racial inequality today, by adding that policing is not only about race and class, which it unquestionably is, but also about policing gender and sexuality, and therefore poor, Black and brown, trans, and gender expansive youth bear the biggest brunt of this policing. And so I look in that chapter at the youth's experiences of police, them often cycling between the jails in the streets and prisons in the streets, and pushing scholars who are studying policing in urban poverty that we can't just focus on race and class, but we also must focus on gender and sexuality, as these are central to policing processes as well. From there, I then have my chapter on queer street smarts, where I argue that the youth not only have to learn racialized and class knowledges about the streets, but they also have to gain gender and sexual knowledge of the streets in order to get by and survive on the streets. So for example, they have to figure out where there's safe bathrooms. They might have to figure out where there's family restrooms that they can access because they experience deep violence in gender segregated bathrooms. Many homeless shelters are obviously gender segregated. And so they often would choose to stay on the streets instead of going to gender segregated shelters where they would experience deep violence, including you've talked to me about getting peed on at these gender segregated shelters. And also the showers at these gender segregated shelters are obviously also gender segregated and were very violent spaces. And so the youth in my, talked about being dirty or trying to find other ways to clean and wash themselves. And so I discussed how there's this added layer of gender and sexuality that they have to learn about urban spaces and services for people experiencing homelessness in order for them to develop strategies to get by. And then the last main substantive chapter is specifically on the LGBTQ shelter, where I argue that unquestionably, it's a much more humane shelter than most shelters, and the fact that it helps the youth get their gender marker changed on their ID, help them get on hormones. I mean, they do so much LGBTQ specific services, but I ultimately argue that it's also, at the end of the day, a shelter is still a shelter, and that it's there to warehouse them, to surveil them, to monitor their behaviors, that the youth, had to get a job, they had a curfew, that they had all these kind of rules around governmentality, that they had to enact this kind of like middle class way of being in the world, or they were constantly getting kicked out. And this was often related to policing their gender and sexuality. So the youth would get kicked out if they were having sex with one another, if they were engaging in sex work at night, etc. And so even if this is a more humane place, it was still often violent and still policing their gender and sexuality, which then in the conclusion where I try to offer many policy solutions. I think one of the biggest ones that I offer is that I think we should abolish homeless shelters. I think ultimately shelters are violent spaces, and that we need to divert funding from shelters to actual housing. So that is a very quick tour of the book, but I will leave it there for now.
Awesome. No, thanks for sharing that. I'm excited to, engage with you on this. I think it's also very timely given, all we've seen in the news probably in the last 48 hours of these last minute Trump administration policy changes, i.e., like homeless shelters being able to turn away queer teenagers, adoption agencies turning away same-sex couples, discriminating on sexual orientation, and wondering how that will change in coming days. So, the work is very timely for that, for this conversation. I wanted to start just thinking about, one saying that I really enjoyed reading the book and really engaging with, how you are doing such an intentional address to, bringing the intersectional ways that these things all come together, right? And one of the things that came to mind immediately when you're saying, to talk about gender means we have to talk about sexuality. And I think coming from sociology departments where I often think many of them don't know that that's what they need to do, right? Is the reason why we still have so many classes that are race, class, gender that don't then talk about sexuality, right? That and that it's impossible really to do in a true way, because often, as you argue, that to think about sexuality often is to think about gender expansive expressions or how people actually embody their genders publicly for others. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about, you did the work, you collected the data, and then writing it up post that. Like, so what was the process of kind of revisiting this and writing not from and no longer in that space? Like, so going back to rewrite up the narratives in the way that you did.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, writing a book is obviously an interesting experience, especially in our field when we're often trained in article writing, and book writing is very different. And then when you're working with stories that you deeply care about. And I would also say, I mean, for me, all my other published work before this, I was writing about populations that I was critical of, and now I'm writing about a population that I care about, and I'm deeply worried about how I'm representing this population because I don't want to further pathologize such an already marginalized population. But I also don't want to paint them as, of course, victims. And so for me, it was really important to center the stories. And so I literally structured every chapter. I just threw all the quotes and all my field notes first into every chapter, like not the literature, not what I wanted my theoretical interventions to be. I was like, I want this to be about the youth stories themselves. Of course, I understand I'm the author and I still have the authority over deciding which narratives and quotes I'm picking. And so I'm aware of that. But I wanted to center the book around the stories. And so I put that in first, and then I try to build from the stories out. And I kind of let the stories, for me, shape what literature I was going to engage with. I mean, like the family chapter, I never saw myself as a family scholar, which in hindsight is funny because both of my dissertation advisors are family scholars. But I have never read anything about family instability in my life, but that was just what I was seeing in the story. So then I had to go read this entire literature on family instability and then see how it wasn't engaging a lot with how this related to gender and sexuality, or how the policing of gender and sexuality within the family added this other experience of tension and instability within already unstable environments. So that was part of it. I mean, part of it was also, I think I did all right. Well, I tried to show resistance in every chapter to move away from that these youth are just victims of their circumstances and that we need to save them, which I think is a dangerous thing that many urban sociologists often do in their writing. But these youth, I mean, they were resisting all the time. And as I already mentioned, like I saw them choosing the streets in and of itself as a form of resistance that I think we need to take seriously, that they resist, they say schools, the family, homeless shelters, all these places do not value who I am and are not safe spaces for me. And so I'm going to choose the streets over all these institutions that are supposed to be there to help me, to protect me. And so I think if we think about that as resistance, one, it just shows the agency of the youth, but then it can also help us rethink like, whoa, what does it mean that the youth are choosing the streets over all these institutions that are failing them? And what does that put on us who want to, you know, create a better society if we're seeing how these institutions are deeply failing them, that they want nothing to do with them? So I would say that was kind of two things. One, just centering the stories, and two, trying to have resistance be a narrative throughout each chapter so they're not just seen as like helpless victims of their circumstances, which they're not at all. I mean, they were resisting their parents, their teachers, the bullies. I mean, they were fighting back all the time, the police, the service providers at the shelters, etc.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. To me, and fair warning to everyone, I'm just like jumping around in my mind around like what the questions are. Of course, they're in order, but we're not just going in order of how the book goes, because I think, you know, so much of it is about like how these running threads go. So as you were talking about that, it made me think, you know, the resistance I think comes through. And I also did really enjoy that, you know, the voices of the folks you're talking to comes through, right? In every section, it's starting off with folks talking, like you get to hear directly from young people about how they are engaging or what they're going through, what their experiences are. First question I'm thinking is, one, as someone who also does work around quote unquote youth, let's think about what this term means. And I think as at least what I think of as a term that has so many different meanings depending on where and how, like whatever institution you're thinking of. So I think in my work, I think, you know, oh, the organizations will say like 12 to 24. And then it's like, well, maybe 12 to 25. And the CDC sometimes like 12 to 29. And so you're wondering, you know, what is youth, what is adult, what is not? And so like, how do, you know, many of these folks are, you know, 22, 23, 21, right? And struggling with the tension of quote unquote youth, feeling infantilized, right, by the folks who are working with them in these shelters, and rejecting and trying to push back against all these structures. Do they see themselves as youth? And what does it mean that we classify them or even think about them as youth if they are of certain ages? Or is this about like development or where they are in their lives? Like what makes them youth versus not, I think is where I think this question is, at least for me.
And then now I'm like, oh, am I committing violence that I classify them as youth? Because I think the youth themselves, or the people in my study, were very much against I don't know if they were against being classified as youth, but they were definitely, as I write about, especially in the 5th chapter, the shelter chapter, as being seen, as being treated as kids, right? And so if we think the label of youth does this work of infantilizing them, then it might be a problematic term that we need to grapple with. Because I mean, for the youth, I say, right, like they were like, the shelter workers were like, well, you gotta set an alarm, you gotta be at breakfast at 7, then you gotta go to your GED class at this time. And like, they were trying to like schedule all these things like you would maybe, your kindergartner. And the youth are like, I can set my own alarm. I know how much sleep I need to get myself. I know my own body. Like, why are you giving me a bedtime? And so I think the people in my study were very much against at least being treated as if they were children. And so if we think the label of youth does that work of them being treated that way, then I think it is a term that we really need to question, because I do think it does do that, right? Like, I think the shelter providers can be like, this is a youth shelter, and so we view you as youth, and then youth gets conflated with being a child or a kid or something, and then we treat them that way, and we start regulating their behaviors in that way. Yes. At the same time, the youth in my study, they didn't want to go to adult shelters. I mean, they saw adult shelters as very violent. They saw adult shelters as very unsafe, both, especially like in Austin, because there is no youth shelters at all in Austin. There's only transitional living programs for youth, which comes with different, rules and stipulations in shelters. And so many of the youth in my study were like, in Austin, like, we're living on the streets because I'm not going to the adult shelter. Like, I'm not an adult. I'm not dealing with those issues. And so I do think there was that, that I think the concept of youth works in this way of engaging in infantilizing practices towards them. But at the same time, they also did not see themselves as at least similar as adult homelessness populations.
Mm-hmm. I think that's super important, and interesting, right? That's the tension. And I think probably also fundamentally that many of the funding mechanisms also are then often centering youth interventions or projects. So like, oh, you're getting money because you're working with young people, and what that means, while at the same time they're rejecting, I'm not that young because I'm an adult, I can do what I want, but also I'm not old enough to be considered an adult. I think a lot of my undergraduate students do the same thing. For teaching methods, it's like, oh, I watched or observed these adults doing things. Like, what are you? You all are 20. So what does that mean? I think that's a great point. And when you talk about the differences between San Antonio and Austin, one of the things that came to mind is, now being, at Riverside, being in LA, I think, how has the work continued for you, like thinking about LA, right? Or thinking about this? I mean, you come to one of the, like the second largest city in the country with probably the, one of the most well-known homeless districts, right? Or, thinking about Skid Row or the work around that, and dealing California on the verge of and continuing to be in this massive homelessness crisis, right? Like that we just don't have adequate shelter for all of the folks in the state. How do you see these as different, right? What are the differences that you are seeing maybe here, or thinking about what it means to look at this in Austin, San Antonio versus like this California experience?
Yeah, I think there's several differences. One, I mean, I think we often think of LA as somehow much more progressive than maybe we might think of Texas, but of course, that's not the case. And there's plenty of LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness here as well. I think what's different, I mean, obviously I haven't studied this systematically. This is just based on my experiences at the LGBT Center here. I mean, we have, well, they build themselves as, the LA LGBT Center builds themselves as like the largest LGBT center in the country or in the world or something. I mean, it's a multi-million, if not billion-dollar place, right? So I went to a volunteer training there because I was going to start volunteering at the homelessness shelter that they have for LGBTQ youth. And it was just similar processes of, well, what I call in chapter 5, homonormative governmentality of about, they're addressing homelessness through individual solutions. It's about getting the youth jobs, getting them, they showed this video like, oh, I came to this shelter, I was homeless, and then I got a job, and now I'm married. And, and so it's this very homonormative approach and very individualistic approach still that they're dealing with homelessness here, instead of actually dealing with more systematic issues. I think fighting for a living wage would be a better way to deal with homelessness in LA, working towards affordable housing instead of trying to get them jobs. What's interesting though, and I when I first moved here, I was really interested in studying it, but then I realized I think I've said all I've wanted to say on homelessness, and I'm going to move on to a new topic for my next book. But they were opening, I don't know how the pandemic shaped it, but I went and took a tour. They opened a new shelter, and it's right on the campus in Hollywood. That's for LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness and LGBTQ elders experiencing housing instability. And so they're all going to be living together on this campus. And their theory, and I think it's probably a good theory, but I guess someone will have to study it and find out because it's not going to be me no more, is that this kind of intergenerational connection between the LGBTQ elders and the LGBTQ youth in this campus space will do some type of positive work. And so I think that would be a fascinating place to study, but my assumption is that they're still probably going to take individualistic approaches to solving homelessness. Again, though, as I write in the book, we have, and as you mentioned funding earlier, this is all often shaped by funding, and that the donors understand homelessness or want the solutions to homelessness to be through these individual ways of getting a job, getting your GED. We're not getting funded to overthrow capitalism, right? Or we're not getting funded to even really, build affordable housing. So most of what they get constrained by is who their funders are. And of course, the main funder is HUD, the US, Housing and Urban Development. So
yeah, no, I think, no, that's a great answer. Two things. One, I would say, oh, great, like Brandon's now giving whoever wants to do this project a great way to do it. There you go, field site in LA for you to work on. But great question, how funding is really shaping the behaviors. And I think you do a great job of addressing this, like, what I consider to be, at least in my view, like a fundamentally sociological issue that we're always focusing on around like personal problem or social issue, right? And that, yeah, we can continue to try to get people to get jobs and, and move out and get this, whatever, but there's not enough housing for people anyway. So like there's a fundamental, contradiction through even going through this individualistic process where even, can there be success stories? And I think you talk about this in the book because, as you read, at least as I was reading through the end, I really enjoyed that, we get to that, that chapter and you're probably thinking, or whenever I present this, people are always like, are there any success stories? And I think at that point I was thinking, yeah, this doesn't sound great. Like, it doesn't sound like they're, that anything, all of these students are not students, all these young people are ending up back in the shelter or in these very complex back and forths with their families or other like instabilities. But I think the point is, what would a success story be, right? Or like, is it even possible to have a success story when the focus is only on these individualistic, one-off, like, oh, I made it and I got married, this one person. The question isn't, oh, you made it because of this program. It's kind of like almost in spite of some of these programs and these tactics that folks are using. And I think that's an important like moment, I think, in the text, because I do think as you read it, the stories are very harrowing. Like, I think the experiences that they share are very, very violent sometimes, very sad. And you get to this point where I do think by the end you're wondering, like, does anybody make it? Like, what actually happens? And then you have to check yourself and really say, well, what would making it mean, right? Like, in this context, like, can you actually see that? And I think that's an important consideration. It makes me also think then though about the focus of the work in writing out strategies. So you mentioned this earlier, like thinking, okay, they're resisting, they're doing these things, they're strategizing. And one of the moments when you're writing about the police strategies, so, or rather I'll reconfigure that I was looking for strategies for how they were avoiding the police in that sense. But then I'm thinking to myself, well, what would it mean for you to write this down? And what are the implications of showing these resistance strategies and behaviors and patterns for all different types of readers, right? Like, what are the implications of sharing these on the ground strategies that folks are using to try to avoid dealing with these systems, with also still trying to be clear and transparent about what's going on the ground? Like, what's the almost like an ethical conundrum of like, I want to say what's happening, but what are the implications if I say what's happening that someone else could use this information against the group of people we're trying to protect in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Like, how much do we disclose about how they're resisting these institutions? Because then, of course, people in these institutions can then read the text, figure out their strategies, and then use it against them or use it to further police, punish, and surveil them. And so I thought about, I mean, I don't write about police strategies at all. Partly, I had only a few data points on it because my methods limited me to my actual field sites, that I couldn't actually be, and the police were at my field sites all the time, which I write in the book, as a way to scare them away from accessing services. But I could only see their interactions with police at my actual field sites and not out in the larger world, because I signed agreements with both my field sites that I wouldn't interact with the youth outside of my field sites. So watching them interact with the police was limited to the field sites, and they did engage in strategies when the police were there that I don't write about because I just I had no intention of exposing those things, and I didn't want to add further to making those things. But I do, of course, write about many of the strategies that they use in, the Queer Streets March chapter, about how they're navigating shelters and services and bathrooms and other things. And yeah, I mean, I don't think the strategies I write there expose them to anything. Like, I think the strategies that I use, and maybe you can, correct me if I'm wrong, or your reading of it, but the strategies I use them to expose the larger institution. So I don't think I write about strategies that might expose them to further surveillance. I just write about strategies that are basically help us to critique how these larger institutions have failed, such as gender segregated shelters and the violence that they produce. But I would hope, me writing about them looking for family or handicap bathrooms doesn't lead to the dismantling of family and handicapped bathrooms. I hope that they hopefully lead to the expansion and eventually the expansion of those types of restrooms, and eventually the abolition of gender segregated restrooms that I think we don't need and shouldn't exist.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely can't tell you that. I don't think it wasn't in my read like, oh, you're giving away all the secrets. But I mean, even if you were, I mean, there's this kind of whole thing of like, if someone were to read it and not know or think to themselves, oh, this is a strategy I can use, right? Like at least in how I write my work and I think about things, it's like, can I write this in a way that if someone who shared the identities of the folks I'm studying could use this information to help them depending on what their situation is, right? And so there's a goal to say, like, the danger is always like, yes, you would hope they don't use this to say, oh, they're seeking out, we need to get rid of these family, gender neutral bathrooms or whatever, right? But you never know what people will do. And so I think the implications of that is always something that's at the forefront of the mind. You mentioned another thing that made me think of one of the questions I know I sent about, in the methodological appendix, you kind of put forward this idea of compassionate detachment, right? And the reason this comes to mind now is because you say you signed this the MOU to say this agreement. I won't hang out with the young people outside of the shelter, or they don't need to know certain things about me. I won't discuss certain things with them. And you know, the reason why it was, I think, very interesting to me is because I feel like in my work, I had I don't want to say the complete opposite kind of situation, but it was like there was no rules. Like they were just like, yeah, come and do what you want to do, you know, like, and so there was no, oh, don't hang out with them or see them in other places. Cause I often did see them in the club, you know, in another place, you know, in other environments at the malls and those types of things, and would spend time with them in other ways. How do you think the rules, the set of rules that were given to you from the shelter, like as part of your role in volunteering, shaped, you know, what you felt? I mean, part of like defining this conundrum of like, or like this idea of like compassionate detachment is I'm not here to save them, I'm not here to do this for them. But what are the situations where you're like, you know, you say you don't enforce the rules all the time because you look at some of those rules as harmful, right? Like I'm not going to kick you out of the shelter because of this particular moment, even though that is your role in the space, right? Like you signed an agreement to say you'll do that. Are there other things that you're kind of like, this was difficult to navigate, like signing this agreement that says I won't see anyone or talk to anyone outside of the shelter, or I won't, you know, be around the young people in other spaces or see what's going on with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think being a volunteer researcher was really hard and it pulled on so many ethical things, both in the field and in the course writing that I try to get at in the appendix and in the concept of compassionate detachment that I offer up as a way to maybe think about these things. And so one is like, I was supposed to follow these rules as a volunteer. And some of them, because most of them are based on this kind of social work therapy thing. So it's like, you know, a therapist is not supposed to approach you if you're their patient outside of, you know, the therapy room. And so it's those types of rules that if I saw the youth anywhere, you know, I was supposed to leave immediately. I was never supposed to approach them myself, etc. But of course, and I talk about this at the shelter where I was the only one there, like no other staff, no other volunteers were there. I was supposed to be enforcing the rules of bedtime, of curfew. I mean, I had the power to kick them out, which, you know, many of the staff used all the time as a way to try to control the youth. But of course, I had no want, need, or desire to kick anyone out of a shelter because I thought it was violent and does nothing to address or solve homelessness to kick someone back to the streets. And so I guess I ultimately decided, so one, yes, I only interacted with the youth at my field sites. I was fine with that compromise. Someone else can go study LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness but are not accessing organizations. And I was fine with that methodological compromise. But the compromises I wouldn't make would be things that would harm the youth themselves. Or well, I try to always put the needs of the youth first. And so if they didn't make it past curfew, I could care less. I was never going to tell them what time they could go to bed. They can make that decision for themselves. I never wrote any of them up for any infractions, etc., because I thought that those rules harmed people. Of course, in the book, I write about at least 2 instances that I still think haunt me deeply. And I don't know if I did the right thing. But of course, one was who I call Obadiah, got very violent at the shelter one night and was throwing things and breaking things. And the other youth at the shelter were very worried, or they said that they were very worried about their safety. And they were like, we need you to call campus security because we'd feel unsafe. Like, Brandon, we need you to do this. And of course, I had no want, need, or desire to call campus security. I, of course, had no want, need. I had no clue what Obadiah was going to do next, if he could harm himself, harm others. And so I end up calling security. And security comes, the security person and I talk to Obadiah. Obadiah ends up saying that he'll stay in his bed for the rest of the night. And he doesn't get kicked out, of course, because I didn't want him kicked out. But I mean, I don't know. Like, I think calling security was probably very violent and something that is not part of my politics as, you know, a prison and police abolitionist, as someone who doesn't believe in like adding further surveillance. And so I don't know if I made the right decision. I don't know if I would have made a different decision now in hindsight, because who knows what would have happened. So I think, I mean, what I try to write about in the appendix is like, you know, we have to, one, know that when you're doing an ethnography, you never know what's going to happen when you're in the field, and IRB can never prepare you for that, or thinking about your project ahead of time can never prepare you for that. And so I think we just always have to be present and in the here and now, and then try to center the needs and try to think about the least amount of harm that we're going to do when we're there, but also know that we probably aren't always going to make the right decision. And I guess we got to figure out ways to grapple with that. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, ethnography itself is probably a violent field of study, because we're studying other human beings. And so we're already surveilling them, objectifying them, etc. And so I just think we got to grapple with all of the ethics that go into then this type of approach.
Yeah, you know, thinking through, you know, what does it mean to conduct ethnographies and to insert yourselves into the lives of other people, and to consistently be fighting against this? How much involvement is too much involvement? What do I do? You're like, do you make this decision? Do you help? Do you not help? I mean, I think I found it so fascinating because I think so many of the things that come up for you come up for me, and I think we made some different choices. And not that I think one is right or wrong, but I think that for certain reasons things happen. So even though I wasn't working in like a homeless shelter, a lot of the young folks were experiencing homelessness and were doing things, and there were moments where I would be like, they're like, oh, can I get a ride here? And I'm like, sure. You have this contract that says, oh, we're not giving them ride, we're not doing these things. And I'm like, yeah, I'll take you there. I mean, I'm driving. I'm not gonna like, you know, tell you to walk across LA to get to this thing. Like, I'll just drop you off kind of thing. But those were also some of the moments where I think, at least at my work, that they started to trust me more, because they had such, at least, you know, the folks I was working with were so distrustful of researchers in general that their immediate response was, oh, we didn't think. So I was talking about, you know, the moment where they get in my car, I turn on the radio and they're like, what, you listen to this too? And I'm like, what did you all think I was listening to? You know, I'm like, I'm the same age as most of you, we're same race, all that. And they're like, we thought you were listening to smooth jazz. And I was like, where are you getting this from? So those moments, right, those like not formalized moments in our ethnographies, or those choices that we make, I think break down those barriers, or like can make you closer and create those bonds. But I was definitely fascinated by this idea that there was your project was not only bound by your own ethics and morals around how to conduct the ethnographic process, but by the actual structures put in place by the institution itself, right? That, oh, you won't do these things. It's not your role to help them to do, or to quote unquote save them, as you write about, right? Like, there are certain things that you are not there to do for them. And that, you know, I do think you're right. There are no right decisions, right? It just becomes this moment of, yeah, you don't want to call, you know, you don't want to call the security guard, but how do you deal with the conundrum of the fact that the other folks who are also in the shelter are then saying, we feel unsafe, right? So what are the needs for the challenge of like needing rules and security, quote unquote, to make them feel secure, compared to, you know, not wanting to institutionalize, or like to institute more surveillance or more kind of security on them. I found the book is full of these like conundrums around like how things are set up in the world and then how things are playing out. And I think an example of this is like when you talk about how some of the youth are experiencing dealing with the police, and the interactions they describe are just like full on surveillance for no reason. Like police stopping them as they're going, like they're just walking, and saying, nothing's open at this hour, what are you doing? Right? Like, we think about this, you know, that it's just not a question for many people. Like if you're walking somewhere at a certain day of time, that the police are gonna stop you and ask, what are you doing? Or you're sitting on a bench and they're like, why are you here? But you know, this is what the bench is for sitting. Like, I'm not doing anything on the bench, but you're stopping me from, they're like, get up and move, right? And so how those different things are constantly clashing was something I thought you did a really great job of like showing all the time, right? These conundrums, like state protection and violence, right? That CPS is supposed to protect all these young people, but then they do an awful job of it, right? So like, which, you know, what's the right choice to make in those spaces? What would you say, I think, around some of these conundrums, you know, um, one of them that also came to mind was about you talked about Obadiah, I thought, who was an interesting case, who at one point you say is dating or was in relationship with another one of the respondents. You have Naomi, right? And how that plays out. Like there's the kind of like a domestic violence situation that plays out in the work, right? So how do you deal with that? Like in not just in the write up, but in the moment of like interfacing with them as you're conducting the project. And I'll follow that up with, can you also talk a bit about, okay, have any of them seen or read any of the stuff that you've written up about this experience, and how has that been received by them?
Yeah. So Obadiah and Naomi are both staying at the San Antonio shelter. Obadiah is a white cis man, and Naomi's a trans Latina woman. Well, Latina. They start dating, and they get expelled from the shelter because they get caught having sex, as many of the youth got expelled from the shelter for having sex. And so they go live on the streets, and then Obadiah commits sexual violence. He rapes Naomi while they're living on the streets together, and then he goes to jail. Naomi comes back to the shelter, and then, she talks about it in our interview, of course. And so it was a conundrum of, well, it was hard, the ethics of like, how do I write this up in a way that I'm trying to document the violence that trans women who live on the streets face. And I don't want to pathologize Obadiah, who, early in the book, I talk about all the violence he went through. I mean, his father and mother, he grew up in a very domestic violence place. He goes into CPS at 8 and gets separated from his siblings. He doesn't see his siblings at all for a decade until he gets out of CPS. So there's already all this other violence that Obadiah himself has experienced. And then this violence then gets happens among two of the people that I'm working with in my study. So, I mean, I ultimately obviously decided to write about it because I felt like it was an important study thing to show, to one, understand these larger structures that had pushed people or that shaped this moment that then happens. But I also just felt like it was such an important story of Naomi's that she wanted told and that she really wanted out there, because she didn't know how to, I don't know, it became this story for her where she's like, all I want is love. And I thought that this was going to get it because I have not gotten it anywhere, because every institution has abandoned me. Every person in my life has abandoned me. And then she thought, she was going to get it from Obadiah. And then this violence happens, and then she's trying to grapple with that. And so I just felt like it was an important story to tell, just to capture that moment. None of the youth have read my book, so I stayed in contact with several of them after the study, but I would say within a year, I had fallen out of contact with the 3 that I was still in contact with. I mean, partly it's just, it's a transient population, their phone numbers change all the time, etc. So partly I just think it was just the logistics of that. So none of the youth that I know of have read the book. But when I was writing, I wrote a HuffPost piece years ago, and I did send that to the youth when I was still in contact with some of them. So other than that, none have read it that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. No, I think that's that was one question I had, to read this, because you're getting both perspectives, right? Like, as you say, you set up this situation, so you feel for Obadiah's case in general, and then later on it's revealed that that there's this, situation between the two. So you're getting all of this kind of all at the same time, that it just is just a very strongly negative story all around. I think, like the failures of all of these systems, and then the struggle of being in the the shelter at the same time, but fighting against those same things. I think, ironically, we're going to kick you out for having sex, in line with the idea that this is an LGBTQ focused like it's like, well, where else are they having sex? It makes me think of, you know, like Not Under My Roof, the, you know, where you're like, okay, where are these where are these kids having sex? And, you know, American parents are like, not under my roof, like not in my house. But then, you know, these shelters that are supposed to be affirming of their, not of their, not really of their sexual behaviors, right? They say, as you know, they say don't shame them about their sexual explorations, but the idea is also that but you can't explore here. But then they're supposed to be there for all of these specific moments in time. Like you have to be here at 7:30 in the morning, or you have to go to bed at this certain time. So when else are they supposed to do? Presumably, one of the major reasons why they got kicked out of their homes, or they're leaving their homes, or these negative environments, right, to express their sexualities and to explore that element of themselves. But then they're going into these shelters where it's also getting policed in these very clear ways. So that just seemed like a, you know, a glaring issue. And I was fascinated because I don't think we hear as much from like, and I think this is intentional, from like the staff or the folks that you're interfacing with in that way. But like, what is their, like, I'm sure you talk to them, you're like, what is their perspective on this? I mean, you're saying they're enforcing the rules. They think of this as this, like no one else is like, this doesn't make any sense. They're all just like, okay, like, yeah, y'all are having sex, get out. Like, you know, what do we do? Like, how do, you know, who's running the place? You know, how does that go?
Yeah, I mean, the staff, I do think somewhat bought into this, what I call homonormative governmentality, that they needed to be the right kind of LGBTQ person as the way to get out of homelessness, instead of, I mean, as I write, I think the staff were amazing, caring. I mean, the person that founded the LGBTQ shelter was like this somewhat rich lesbian who like gave up her career and like decided she's going to devote the end of her life to the shelter. And she doesn't have a social work background or nothing. Like she was just like, she saw a need that no one in San Antonio was addressing. And she's like, I'm going to try to do something about it. So, and I think she's an amazing human being and I love and adore her. But they got so caught up in the funding and in the larger rules of the larger campus that the shelter gets located on, that I just don't think I don't know. I mean, my understanding, I don't know, that the rules at the shelter have somewhat changed since I've been there, but I haven't followed up on that. That's just what I've heard. But yeah, when I was there, I don't think they saw this disconnect of like, literally, as you said, like their handbook was like, we're not going to shame them, we're going to let them sexually explore, and then they were constantly kicking people out for having sex. Where literally the only other places that the youth in my study were having sex were often under a bridge or in the library. Whereas if they get caught having sex there, like they're going to go to jail and could, you know, potentially end up on the sex offender list. So it's like the consequences of that is grave.
Yeah, one of those conundrums where you're like, did we really think this through all the way? Like, where else are they supposed to have sex if there's, you know, we're acknowledging their sexuality, but like don't enact it, like actually in this space, like, you know, especially if this is home where they get to lay their heads or where they get to do these things, or these rules about like not dating, like folks can't date each other in this space, right? So they're not able to meet other people necessarily all the time, but this is one of the first places they may come where they're able to actually meet other queer folk, you know. But the idea is like, oh, but you can't be in relationship with another person who's in the shelter. Like, what is you know, those decisions and ideas behind that, I think are massively important. One question I think also that I wanted to spend some time in thinking about, and I think you get to this when you started to talk a little bit in the quick overview at the beginning about like, what are the recommendations? Like, what do we take away from this book? And one of the things, you know, in the conclusion is like this idea of housing first, right? And this idea that like, yes, we know research-wise that like providing housing is a cost-effective strategy. Like it costs us less to provide housing and stable, you know, resources and things for folks who are experiencing homelessness than it does to leave them out on the streets, right? Because we end up dealing with it and paying for it in other ways. But that rationale has not really changed any of the behavior, right? And we often think of the ways that money fuel things, right? So everything is about, oh, well, this is where the money is, or this is how things are funded. But even with this narrative, like, hey, it would actually be cheaper if we just did the right thing and gave stable housing, that doesn't seem to shift the priorities of cities and districts and governments to actually make that a reality, right? And so to me, it's like, have you thought about what are other tactics or rationales to legitimate, especially if people don't care enough, right? Like, what is that? And then you may not have an answer for that, because I don't mean, obviously, we haven't figured it out yet because nobody's done it. But I think this is where we are. Like, what do we do if we can't convince you to do this because it's cheaper? Then, like, what in the world will convince you that this is the right thing to do?
Yeah, I'll try to quickly answer this, and then Crystal wants us to shift to Q&A because there's some great questions. I mean, I don't have the answer to this, and I was trying to grapple with it in the conclusion, because we know that like housing people is at least 3 times cheaper than allowing them to cycle through jails and social services, and yet we don't do it. I mean, obviously, I think we don't do it because we want to dehumanize certain groups of people, to uphold capitalism, to uphold white supremacy, to uphold heteronormativity. Like, we need this group of people to be like, you don't want to be like that, so you need to work hard and yada, yada, yada. So I would assume it's probably we just don't do that because we want to uphold this like neoliberal notion of, having a house and everything else and success. These neoliberal notions of success is, I guess, the state is invested in more, and they're willing to spend much more money on upholding that while committing deep acts of violence, including death, on certain populations in order to uphold those things. I guess would be my answer, but I don't know how we get around that without dismantling these systems, which is always, of course, my answer.
It's dismantle it all, though. I'm in agreement. No, I hear you. So, no, thanks for answering that. Yeah, I know we're turning to the Q&A, so
Yeah.
to you. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to. I mean, I could listen to both of you forever. There's just a lot of questions. I want to be sure that we get to some of the questions. So I'm going to, for the most part, go down the list of questions that were submitted. I might bounce around a little bit just because I think some questions might have been addressed, or I just want to make sure that multiple people have a chance to ask questions too. So just in terms of distribution. So the first question is, what are the current challenges in moving from shelters to houses for the youth? Funding, perhaps.
The current challenges in moving from shelters to houses. I mean, the only challenge is that we're just not doing it. I don't find it that challenging. Like, just put people in houses. Like, they exist, houses exist. There's plenty of empty houses around this city. So just put people in houses. I don't think we need to warehouse people. I mean, the tenets of at least housing first is like, we get people in houses without any rules or stipulations. So it doesn't have to be, don't be on drugs or whatever these other rules that we often have to access services. And then once we get people in the houses, we then try to address what their needs are. And we come to them, like, what are your needs? We don't tell them what their needs are. And then we work to address their needs. But just get people housing, I just don't think is hard. Like, there's houses, people in houses, and then help them after they're in housing. I mean, we're spending millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, on shelters, and shelters are just warehousing people and are cycling people between jails and the streets and aren't actually doing anything. So, like, stop giving money to shelters and put more money towards building houses.
Okay, so there's a cluster of questions that focus on housing. So maybe I'll go through that really quickly. And I'll try to post this in the chat too. So let's see, 2 questions. So what kind of housing would be ideal for homeless folks? So is there sort of ideal housing, tiny homes, apartments, houses? And then let's see, what is the difference between housing and the shelters? Does that make sense?
Well, housing, you have a lot more privacy and ideally a lot more rules, and you're not warehoused with a bunch of other people on bunk beds. So that alone, I just think is a huge difference in quality of life. Um, Ideal, I mean, I guess it would just depend. Maybe some people would like tiny homes. You know, families experiencing homelessness might want different types of homes. They started this like tiny house place in Austin when I was leaving Austin, where they built like 250 tiny houses for people experiencing homelessness, all like on this plot of land that was nowhere near downtown. So downtown is where most services for people experiencing homelessness were. So they built all these tiny homes far, far, far away from where the other services were that people needed, which made no sense. But I guess they were trying to see if this tiny house thing would solve issues. But I don't know how that's doing. And it also had a very Christian focus as well. As most services for people experiencing homelessness are deeply shaped by religion. But I don't think there's any one type of particular housing that we need. I think it would just depend on the needs of the person or people experiencing homelessness. And, you know, not every, I mean, part of I think it's in Righteous Doping, they also talk about like, maybe not everyone wants to be in individual housing because they've built these deep relationships on the streets, and then you put them by themselves in housing, they might experience extreme isolation and the mental health challenges that come with that isolation. And so we can also think of like community housing that people might want to be in. So I don't think there's like a one size fit all model, I guess is my point.
Dustin, not to put you on the spot, but you asked some amazing questions. I know there are 3 or 4 questions that you asked. So do you want to focus on sort of one particular question or like a cluster of questions? So please feel free to unmute your mic if you feel like it might be better to offer those questions, or I can just post them in order, whatever you feel like would work.
Sure. I think the one that I found myself going back to was for the staff that were in the centers, particularly if they were white. Did you find that any of them were having moments of kind of critical reflection on their whiteness as they were enforcing some of these rules and policies and really inflicting real violence on youth?
No, I don't think any of them had any critical reflection on their whiteness. I mean, I don't want to excuse, I mean, first of all, these people are extremely underpaid. I mean, they're mostly social workers, extremely underpaid. And I mean, I try to write in the book that I think they're doing the best they can, and I think they care deeply, but that even when people care, we can still enact what I call queer necropolitics, you know, Jasbir Puar's concept on people. Even so, which I think should scare us, that even through people who care deeply can enact this type of violence. But no, I don't. There was never, I don't think, any self-awareness, at least that they explicitly said to me during my 18 months around them or during my interviews with them about their own whiteness. And most of them were white, yes, in relation to their interactions with the youth.
So Dustin, there's one of your questions I actually do want to go back to if we have time, because it's such a good question, but let me just show, so folks have a chance to answer their questions, multiple people. Maybe the next question is, and I'll include this in the chat on ethnography, when reporting your methods, findings, etc. Is this something that needs to be shared, that you built friendships or assisted them in a way, such as giving them rides, they were staff, etc., as it could possibly influence results? And this might actually be a question for both Brandon and Terrell. So I'll put that in.
Yes, please. I didn't fully get the question.
Okay, I just put it in the chat.
I mean, when I write, I mean, of course, we always decide what we're going to disclose and not disclose in our writing. I think we should try to disclose as much as possible that we don't think is going to harm them, so we can help each other think more ethically about methods. If you're someone who's deeply devoted to methods and perhaps to feminist and queer ethics in our methods, then I think disclosing these things help us get there, right? So if we talk about, you know, I did break the rules that I was supposed to do, and I did this and that. I mean, like Terrell said, I think it's like me breaking the rules, and part of what I write, like me not enforcing the rules, I think helped me build rapport. And I was like, I want to build rapport. I'm a researcher. I want to build rapport. And I think one way to build rapport is like not to make them go to bed. And so if we care about rapport and the ethics behind rapport, then I think disclosing those things can help other researchers learn those things. But I don't think we have to disclose them. I guess it just depends what you want your methodological appendix to do and how much you're committed or devoted to conversations around ethics and methods. I thought trying to disclose my ethical conundrums and how I related and interacted with the youth is important for other people who are going to move forward in working with youth, especially marginalized youth. I don't know how you feel about that, Terrell.
No, yeah, I think I agree. You know, for me at least, I think you do your best to let folks know in your write-up what exactly you did and how you came about doing it and why. And I think this question of like how it influences results, I think everything we do kind of influences our results. Like I think it's a misnomer or even a false ideal to believe that my presence in a space that are, you know, especially in these intimate small spaces where you're dealing with people and talking about that, like talking to small groups all the time, that your presence doesn't impact them, right? Like in some ways you have to give up a little bit of yourself for folks to trust you somewhat, right? They have to learn some things about you. You're not always a quote unquote, like this idea about being a fly on the wall. And so for me, it was more important to do, like when I think about giving rides and stuff, you know, there was a moment where someone got like beat up or like jumped coming off the train going to the community organization. So they were afraid to like go back that way. So I'm like, I'm one of the only people who has a car. I'm not going to tell you to go ahead and walk and then find out later what happened. Like, that's just not, I think as a politic, it was just like, it doesn't make sense to me. So whatever the rule or the expectation is, I just wouldn't be able to bring myself to do that. And so I think writing that down or writing that information, people can take it how they will. If they think that that influenced my results in a negative way or any project in a negative way, I mean, the most negative thing you can come with is like, oh, you gave someone a ride to the train or you gave someone a ride home because there was like a potential for violence or they were afraid of something. I mean, sue me. I don't know. Like, I just think that's what we do. You have to make those decisions in the field. And I think telling folks that and being upfront and honest about it is the most important thing, because yes, if you're committed to methods, like Brandon says, and doing this the right way, I think we're in this process of learning and especially teaching new researchers how to do methods and how to conduct that. It's like, my goal is to get you to say, there's no right answer in the field as long as you're not doing something unethical. You have to go beyond what the IRB is concerned with and do something more morally just, if you will. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'm so my wonderful colleague Tammy has been helping me field questions and cluster them. So thank you, Tammy, so much gratitude. So I'm going to ask, maybe cluster a couple of questions around methodology. So let me put it under chat too. So these are sort of 2 questions. So I'll read them out loud. So I know you couldn't interact with the youth outside of the shelter, but what was your relationship like with them while you were at the shelter? And did you do anything specific to build particular relationships with them? And then sort of maybe more broadly, can you talk more about your experience of doing the interviews? What challenges or issues presented themselves during the course of the interviews that you didn't expect? 2 really great questions.
Thank you. And thank you, Tammy. You are amazing. Another wonderful colleague in my wonderful department. Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, I was closer with the youth in San Antonio just because I was the only one there, and my interactions with them are different because we're like sitting on the couch watching movies instead of me like in Austin. I was mainly interacting with them in the clothing closet. So I just think the structure of my volunteer role shaped that. But I mean, it was great. I mean, we listened to music, we danced, they would braid my hair all the time. We would put on wigs all the time. We would put on singing shows, karaoke all the time. We would color, play games. I mean, I try to capture this in the shelter chapter. I mean, there was so much joy and pleasure and fun happening in such a awful, inhumane space. So I deeply came to love so many of them. Of course, you know, some of his personality, you get closer with some people than others just because of how our personalities are. But I mean, I came to really deeply get close with many of them. The interviews, I think when I was doing the interviews, I was fine in the sense that I was just trying to be present, and I was very much in researcher mode of like trying to be an active listener so I could build off of things that they said. The hardest part for me, so I transcribed all of my own interviews because I was a poor grad student at the time. And so the hardest part for me was transcribing the interviews when I had to be alone with the interviews and had to then really listen to the trauma and the pain, and really had to sit alone with that. And so one of my advisors, Gloria Gonzalez Lopez, was like, you should probably go get a therapist. And so I don't write about this in the methods, but I probably should have, is that I got into therapy as a way to deal and process with the pain of the interviews and the own trauma that it like triggered in my own life and my own childhood trauma that came up in listening to the interviews. So for me, the interviews itself, when I was with the youth, it was fine. Like I just was present and I loved every moment that I was with them. But it was when I was with the interviews and then writing the book that I think the trauma and the pain really hit me differently. And so I got therapy, I got into yoga, I started running for the first time in my life, and now I still run. So yeah.
Okay, hold on, let me see. So there are a lot of comments, if you want to read them, Brandon. So just thanking you for shout out to therapy, self-care, self-work, which I think is really important. Thank you for sharing that. So maybe we can, I mean, please feel free. We have trying to give plenty of time for Q&A, but also realize sort of time constraints that folks have. So maybe we can end with this question, but again, if there are more questions, please do let me know. So I'm going to post this question that was offered by Dustin in sort of a cluster of questions, which I think is really important to think about. So, how do we humanize and develop opportunities for queer world making while providing affordable housing? So let me post that question here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I call this my queering housing section of the book, but I mean, I think we need to reimagine housing if we want to link queer world making to housing. And I don't fully know what that looks like, and nor should I be at the center of what that looks like. Of course, I might take the cop out here and be like, poor Black and brown, trans and gender expansive people should probably be at the center of what that looks like. But I think one thing, I think we need to end the privatization of housing. Like, I think we need to rethink what the link between private property and housing and what that is and what that's doing and how that commits violence, and that we can reimagine housing and shelter in a different way beyond this notion of private ownership, I think can move us in the right direction of a queer world-making way of reviewing housing. But I don't fully know what that looks like. I mean, I know there's organizations that are doing stuff around not public housing, but not in the sense of like government public housing, but like collective housing and stuff like that, that might have models that we can learn from. But I just think in general, just even challenging the notion of private property, which is of course a deep, I think, capitalist thing, can start at least queer imagining a different world and what housing might look like when we don't think about it in this privatization way.
So maybe because there's time, there's a question that was offered for Brandon. So how were you able to get the opportunity to do an ethnography? I want to do ethnographies after I graduate.
Yeah, well, I told, again, one of my advisors, Gloria, I was like, I want to study LGBTQ youth homelessness, and I have no idea how to do that, and I have no idea how I'm going to locate LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. And she's like, this is the project, it don't matter, it's just going to happen. And I was like, I don't think it works like that, Gloria, but it happened because literally this LGBTQ shelter opened like right after that conversation. And so I just think like you need to figure out what you think is something you care about and an issue you're deeply invested in. And then once you figure out what that is, what your issue is that you deeply care about, or who you want to study, or the topic you want to study, then you just got to start the work of believe in it and know that it can happen, and then just start building the work of doing it. I think for a lot of ethnographers, it's often finding a gatekeeper. There's often like someone somewhere who can then has access to organizations or to a group of people. But I mean, it can be months and months of labor of trying to find this golden gatekeeper who then opens the gates to your projects. But normally they exist. I mean, I write about in my methodological appendix that, you know, I contacted so many organizations, and I think partly the two organizations I got contact to was that both people that I contacted there were also identified as LGBTQ. One was a lesbian and one was a bisexual woman. And so I think that alone, they cared more about my project because they themselves are part of the LGBTQ community. So I think sometimes it's just this grunge of finding gatekeepers that then open the door for us to get in. So yeah.
Okay, so I might wrap it up. So thank you so much to both Brandon and Terrell for an incredible conversation and talk, and congratulations to Brandon for publishing such an amazing book. So let me, in the chat again, if you came in late, this is a discount, a substantive discount of the book if you want to purchase it. And I just wanted, you know, this was the last sort of book salon event that we're hosting this year from the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. We had 3 incredible scholars, Professors Gunther, Ward, and Robinson, you know, just their generosity in terms of, you know, spending the time with us, but you know, not to sound too mushy, but I have so much gratitude and love for this amazing department. You know, we all know that, you know, there's no such thing as a perfect department, but just a space and the relationship building, I think that happens within the space of the department. I know it doesn't happen everywhere, so just a lot of gratitude. And, you know, I feel like with these books in particular, you know, it's really, we're in this moment where we need books like this. So we need critical scholarship like this that's really thinking through these questions of violence through also critical ethical methods. So just a lot of gratitude. Any last words from Brandon and Terrell before we sign off?
Just thank you, everybody. And of course, a special thanks to Crystal and Terrell for everything. But thanks everybody for engaging. I deeply appreciate it.
Nothing from me. Thank you. You know, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to engage with you. And great job and wonderful, wonderful work. I hope everyone gets a chance to really read it, engage with it.
Thank you so much, everyone. So recording will be available on the CIS website, so you can access it there probably within the next week or so. All right, have a great evening, everyone, afternoon.
Thank you.